Right now, as you are watching this, the same stretch of the Gulf Coast that spent last week baking under a heat dome is filling sandbags instead. Tropical Storm Bertha formed in the northern Gulf on the 20th of July, and the National Hurricane Center has it on track to make landfall in southeast Louisiana within the next day or two, carrying a storm surge of up to 4 feet and rainfall totals as high as 8 inches. In New Orleans, officials have opened dozens of sandbag distribution sites, and the city's water board says 87 of its 93 major drainage pumps are currently operational as crews scramble to clear catch basins ahead of the storm. Here is the part almost nobody explains when a heat wave fades out and a tropical storm shows up in its place within the same week over the same water. These two events are not a coincidence sitting side by side on a calendar. They are directly connected because the same ocean heat that baked the Gulf Coast under high pressure for days is now the fuel Bertha is drawing on to strengthen. And scientists who study this exact handoff say it is becoming a defining feature of how extreme weather actually behaves as the planet warms, not two separate disasters that happen to occur back to back. This is the story of what was actually building underneath this fading heat wave, why the same warm water that made this month brutally hot is now powering the storm behind it, and why the scientists tracking this pattern say the connection deserves far more attention than it currently gets. No hype, no exaggeration, just what the data shows. Drop a comment and tell me if your region has swung from extreme heat directly into storm warnings this summer, because if it has, you are living through exactly the pattern this video explains. I read every one of these. If you want grounded weather coverage built on the actual science instead of recycled panic, subscribe. It is free. And a like helps this reach people who need to understand this pattern before it reaches them. Let us go for 5,000 likes on this one. Thank you. Now let us get into it. To understand why a fading heat wave and a strengthening tropical storm are connected rather than coincidental, you need to understand what actually fuels a tropical system in the first place, because it is the exact same ingredient that made this month's heat dome so intense to begin with: ocean heat. A tropical storm is essentially a heat engine. It pulls warm, moist air up off the ocean surface, and the warmer that surface water is, the more energy the storm has available to convert into wind and rain. Meteorologists specifically flagged that the Gulf's surface waters were sitting in the mid-90s to upper 80s Fahrenheit in the days leading into Bertha's formation, several degrees above what is typical for this point in July, and noted explicitly that if Bertha's center lingered longer over the open Gulf, it stood to draw meaningfully more strength directly from that unusually warm water. That warmth did not appear out of nowhere. It is the same accumulated ocean heat, baked in by weeks of high pressure and clear skies sitting over the region, that also produced the punishing heat dome residents were living through just days earlier. A heat dome and a hurricane sound like opposite kinds of weather, one associated with still, dry, blistering air, and the other with wind and torrential rain. But underneath both of them sits the identical resource, an ocean that has been steadily accumulating extra heat, with each event essentially waiting its turn to draw on the same reservoir. This is why forecasters warned residents along the Gulf Coast that conditions would stay hot right up until Bertha's arrival, rather than cooling gradually the way a typical summer system might. The heat dome did not simply vanish and get replaced by a storm. It persisted alongside the storm's formation, because the high pressure responsible for trapping heat in place across the region was the same broad atmospheric pattern that had to shift before Bertha could organize and begin pulling moisture inland. Meteorologists in Louisiana specifically told residents it was going to stay hot in the days immediately before Bertha's landfall, even as storm surge and tropical storm watches were already posted along the coast, a detail that captures exactly how tightly these two hazards are stitched together in practice rather than existing as separate chapters of the summer. The broader climate context behind this connection is worth understanding honestly, because it explains why meteorologists expect this kind of overlap to keep showing up rather than fading as an unusual one-off. Sea surface temperatures across the Gulf of Mexico and the wider tropical Atlantic have been running measurably above their historical average for a sustained stretch of this year, driven in part by a broader ocean warming trend that the European Union's Copernicus Marine Service has separately confirmed produced the hottest June on a record globally just last month. Warmer background ocean temperatures do two things simultaneously that matter here. They make it easier for stationary high-pressure ridges to trap and intensify heat at the surface, producing exactly the kind of heat dome the Gulf Coast just endured, and they raise the ceiling on how much energy is available to any tropical system that forms nearby, once that same high pressure finally breaks down or shifts out of the way. Scientists studying this describe it as the same underlying driver expressing itself through two different weather phenomena, rather than two unrelated events sharing a calendar by chance. There's a seasonal layer to this as well that matters for understanding why Bertha will very likely not be the last storm to follow the same pattern this year. This year's Atlantic season has, so far, been unusually quiet by historical standards, with Bertha only the second named storm after Tropical Storm Arthur brought flooding rain to Louisiana back in June. And the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's outlook for the Atlantic this year calls for a below normal season overall, projecting somewhere between 8 and 14 named storms compared to a 14 storm average. But that relative quiet in the Atlantic stands in sharp contrast to what has been happening in the Eastern Pacific Basin at the exact same time, where the season has opened at one of the most explosive paces on record, with 4 named storms forming by the start of July, the busiest start to that basin season since 1985, and forecasters there specifically citing what could become the strongest El Niño event on record as the driver behind the surge. No AA has forecast as many as 22 named systems for the Eastern Pacific this year, a total that would rank among the highest ever recorded for that basin. The same El Niño pattern responsible for supercharging the Eastern Pacific is expected to keep strengthening ocean heat content across multiple basins as the year moves toward autumn, which is precisely why meteorologists caution against reading a quiet Atlantic season so far as evidence the rest of the year will stay calm, especially with the Gulf's own water still running warm enough to have handed Bertha extra fuel the moment conditions allowed a storm to organize there at all. There is also an infrastructure dimension to this whiplash that rarely gets discussed alongside the meteorology, and New Orleans this week is a clear, real-world example of it. City officials spent the peak of the recent heat dome managing the ordinary strains of extreme heat, elevated demand on the power grid, and heightened risk for vulnerable residents without reliable air conditioning. And within days, those same emergency management teams pivoted directly into storm preparation mode, distributing sandbags, testing drainage pumps, and issuing evacuation guidance. The city's water board specifically noted it had increased staffing at pumping stations and updated procedures after an earlier thunderstorm this month caused street flooding in several neighborhoods when pump issues surfaced. A reminder that the same infrastructure straining to keep a city livable during extreme heat often has to pivot with almost no recovery time into handling an entirely different kind of emergency once the heat breaks. Emergency officials in the region have been candid that this kind of rapid transition, rather than a single hazard playing out in isolation, is what actually taxes a city's resources and personnel the hardest, because it requires shifting an entire operational posture within days rather than weeks. So what does the actual science say about how directly a fading heat wave and a strengthening tropical system are linked rather than simply following each other by coincidence? Climate researchers studying ocean heat content specifically point to it as one of the most reliable predictors available for how much intensification potential a developing storm has once it forms, precisely because that heat content reflects energy accumulated over weeks or months, not just the temperature on any single day. A heat dome sitting over a region for an extended stretch is one of the more visible symptoms of that accumulated ocean energy building underneath it, which is part of why meteorologists increasingly treat an unusually long or intense heat wave over coastal waters as a signal worth watching for what it might set up afterward, rather than treating its end as the close of the story. Bertha's own forecast reflected this logic directly, with the National Hurricane Center specifically flagging that any additional time the storm spent lingering over the open Gulf, rather than moving quickly toward landfall, would translate into additional strengthening drawn straight from that warm water. Researchers who track ocean heat content specifically for storm forecasting purposes have also pushed in recent years for that measurement to receive the same kind of public attention sea surface temperature already gets, precisely because heat content captures how deep the warm water actually extends beneath the surface, not just how warm the very top layer feels. A storm passing over water that is warm only in a thin surface layer can churn that warmth away quickly as it moves, weakening rather than strengthening. A storm passing over water where that same warmth extends much deeper, the kind of signature a prolonged heat dome tends to leave behind after weeks of clear skies and minimal mixing, has a far larger reservoir to draw from, and is statistically more likely to intensify quickly rather than fizzle out. That distinction is part of why forecasters treat the depth and duration of a preceding heat wave as genuinely useful context when assessing how much a tropical system nearby might still be capable of strengthening, rather than relying on surface temperature alone. So what does all of this actually mean for you, whether you're watching this from the Gulf Coast right now or from somewhere that has not seen a drop of tropical rain this year? The practical lesson is not that every heat wave will be followed by a hurricane. Most will not, since tropical cyclogenesis still requires specific atmospheric ingredients beyond warm water alone, including low wind shear and enough atmospheric instability to organize a storm in the first place. The lesson is that treating extreme heat and tropical storm risk as two separate, unrelated hazard seasons misses what the ocean itself is actually doing underneath both of them. A community that just endured a punishing heat Dome has, by definition, just lived through direct evidence that the water off its coast is carrying extra energy, and that same energy does not simply disappear. The moment the heat advisory is lifted, it becomes available to whatever storm system next has the chance to draw on it. Residents along coastlines that have recently baked under extended heat are being encouraged by forecasters specifically to treat that heat as one more reason, not a reason to relax, to stay alert heading into the more active stretch of hurricane season still ahead. The honest, grounded summary is this. Tropical Storm Bertha formed in the northern Gulf on the 20th of July, directly over water running several degrees warmer than typical for the date, the same accumulated ocean heat responsible for the heat dome that had gripped the Gulf Coast in the days immediately before. That connection is not coincidental. It reflects a single underlying driver, elevated ocean heat content, expressing itself first as a stationary heat dome and then as fuel for the tropical system that followed once atmospheric conditions allowed one to form. This year's Atlantic season remains comparatively quiet overall, but the Eastern Pacific has already produced its busiest start since 1985. And a strengthening El Niño event is expected to keep raising ocean heat content across multiple basins heading into the traditionally more active stretch of the season still ahead. The offshore waters that fueled this month's heat dome and are now feeding Bertha are not expected to cool meaningfully anytime soon either, with the same warm season conditions likely to persist across the Gulf well into the traditional peak of hurricane season in August and September, meaning this will very likely not be the last time this exact handoff plays out along this coastline before the year is over. We are going to keep tracking this pattern exactly the way we tracked it today, straight, from the National Hurricane Center, NOAA, and the researchers actually studying how ocean heat connects extreme heat events to tropical cyclone intensification, not recycled headlines. Subscribe so you do not miss what forms next as this warm water pattern continues into the peak of the season. And leave that comment below. Tell me if your region has swung from a heat advisory straight into a storm warning this year, because that whiplash is not a coincidence. It is the same ocean doing exactly what the data says it will keep doing, and it is worth knowing before the next warm stretch settles in over your own coastline. Because behind every one of these numbers is a family in New Orleans filling sandbags this week who spent last week just trying to survive the heat on the very same stretch of coast, drawing on the very same water. 5,000 likes on this one. Let us go. See you in the next one.